I recently took a trip to the Creation Museum in Petersburg, Kentucky, which teaches that the Earth is 6,000 years old and that dinosaurs and man therefore coexisted. When you first walk into the museum, you see raptors depicted playing next to a lifelike human child. Along the tour, you enter the Garden of Eden to see a wax figure of Adam hugging a lamb in one arm as he extends the other out to a predatory cat. A few feet away waddles a penguin. So in the garden path, a sign next to a dinosaur poses the question, what did dinosaurs eat? It answers, quote, "Before man's fall, animals were vegetarians. In a very good creation, no animal would die, so there were no carnivores. All the beasts of the earth, not just the beasts of the field that God brought to Adam to name, only ate plants." The idea that velociraptors were originally as vegan as a San Francisco yoga instructor, and that the Grim Reaper was utterly unemployed before Adam's blunder, has become canonical within young Earth literature. The New Answers book even contains a picture of a Tyrannosaurus holding a watermelon in its jaws, and teaches the idea that cutting fruit rind may have been their pre-fall function. One young Earth geologist with the Popular Institute for Creation Research writes, quote, "In God's original creation, even the mighty T-Rex was a vegetarian, as were all animals. It wasn't until after the sin of man and the resulting curse that T-Rex became a meat-eater." As mainstream as this interpretation is, I've spent a few years working with the first few chapters of Genesis, and I'm convinced that it's wrong. First, let's consider three of the more obvious logical problems. These are the sort of questions you wanted to ask in Sunday school but knew you weren't allowed. Number 1, scorpions. If animals never harmed or consumed each other before Adam's sin, what exactly did scorpions look like before the fall? Why is their whole body decked out in plate armor like a medieval knight? Why do they need those massive pincers? Why are their hind legs and mesosoma designed to coil forward, putting those hulkish claws with an access of a segmented tail, which is attached to a bulbous hook syringe capable of injecting complex neurotoxins and enzyme inhibitors? Did God create them like this, or were these structures post-fall developments? If these biological structures were all post-fall developments, it's difficult to imagine the unspeakable changes that these organisms had to undergo after the fall. That sounds suspiciously like evolution. If one chooses the first option instead, that God did create animals with all these lethal structures, then we have the massive issue that all sorts of creatures are frolicking around in the garden eating vegetation that they have little or no biological capacity to even digest properly. It's also weird and tremendously deceptive in scientific retrospect that God would create the natural world with all these ironic deadly structures with no other purpose than anticipating Adam and Eve's rebellion. Number 2, Genesis 3 teaches that without access to the tree of life, humanity was created mortal by default. This is why God's strategy of sentencing them to death was simply to kick them out of the garden and station a cherub bouncer so that humanity could not, quote, reach out his hand and take from the tree of life and live forever, according to Genesis 3:22. So young earthers believe humanity, God's highest creation, was originally created inherently mortal, but that all the lower animals were made inherently immortal, like gods. That's very strange. Finally, number 3 is the obvious issue with population control. If Adam had never sinned, every species would presumably be reproducing unchecked by death. If things were permitted to continue in this state, it would create a situation of literally exponential overpopulation, an ecological nightmare. But the biggest reasons for rejecting the original vegetarianism interpretation come from the Bible itself. I cover 5 passages in my forthcoming book, but as far as the Old Testament goes, there are 3 primary texts that young earthers use to justify the idea that there was no animal death before the fall. In presenting the following arguments, I will be heavily drawing on a doctoral dissertation entitled Death in the Garden, written by Joshua J. Van E. Van E. currently teaches Hebrew and Old Testament at Westminster Seminary, California, and his thesis is by far the most culturally linguistically sophisticated exegetical treatment that I've been able to find on this subject. So let's take a look. Genesis 1:29-30. In Genesis 1, God's just created all the animals and human beings. He then tells them, "Behold, I give to you every seed-bearing plant that is upon the face of the earth, and every tree of which is in it the fruit of a tree-bearing seed. To you it shall be for food. And to all the beasts of the earth, and to all the birds of the sky, and to all the creeping things upon the earth, of which is in them the breath of life, is all green herbage for food." And it was so. So God gives animals and humans plants for food in this passage. But does that mean that meat was originally banned like most young earthers claim? The problem with this interpretation is that these verses are immediately preceded in verse 28 by God's command for humanity to, quote, subdue and rule over the animals. Now, if you're like me, you grew up hearing sentimental sermons and reading sappy Lifeway books about how these terms subdue and rule exhort us to steward and care for the earth. But the reality is, in Hebrew these verbs are shockingly harsh, even militant with connotation of violent force. Daniel Stulak, PhD in Old Testament from Duke University, agrees that theologians are guilty of, quote, persistent underreporting of the violence implied by the text's key terms. It is clear from context that these terms are not benign. The passage reads, Vayomelhem Elohim, pir'u urevu umil'u et ha'aretz, vechiveshuha uredu, bidgat hayam uve'of hashamayim uvechol haya harumeset al ha'aretz. And God blessed them and said to them, Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, and over the animals which move upon the face of the earth. The first verb translated subdue here, kavash, occurs 13 other times in the Bible. In 6 of these cases, it's used of war conquest of hostile lands. 5 other passages use it of forcing people into slavery. Among the remaining 2, Micah 7:19 uses it as a reference to trampling underfoot, and Esther 7:8 uses it as a locution for rape. War, enslavement, trampling, and rape. It's no wonder that Christians and Jews who are concerned about animal rights have sought ways of mitigating the harshness of this term in the creation mandate. Despite this, Karl Mueller rightly warns us, quote, we need to be careful not to sanitize the text and make it conform to our modern sensibilities regarding issues such as force and violence. The harshness implied by the terms kavash and radaveh should not be explained away. Some have complained that these 13 uses for the word subdue in the Bible are not a large enough sample size to adequately extract the word's meaning. But this objection is incorrect because the term also shows up in an Akkadian cognate which is proven equally harsh. The takeaway, humanity was commanded to conquer and take rulership over the animals with language similar to Israel's mandate to conquer Canaan through military combat. But what about God's other command that humanity should, quote, rule over the animals? Van E's analysis concludes, quote, the verb by itself can be used to communicate harshness or injustice. The focus is on having power over someone else and not on executing administrative or bureaucratic functions. It is not used for someone ruling over his own people unless that rule involves some sort of oppression or injustice. Again, however uncomfortable the terminology may appear to us theologically from an environmentalist standpoint, the verbs Genesis uses in the creation mandate carry overtones of military conquest and stern rulership. Pete Van Dyke at the University of South Africa agrees. When reading the verse, the first inclination of the ecologically sensitive reader is to try to interpret the words subdue and rule in a less damaging way. However, within its immediate context, the Hebrew words cannot be softened in any way. Even Tucker's study acknowledged that the term subdue is a potentially violent verb, referring to trampling under one's feet in absolute subjugation. Now, beyond the lexical data, there's also compelling logistic reasons for reading this use of violence against animals into the text as well. Notice that God commands humanity to subdue and rule over 3 categories of animals: the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and all the animals which move upon the earth. It is easy to understand how or why a man might subdue and rule over a cow or a sheep without harming it. But how do ancient people subdue and rule over birds or fish? Is Adam going to hook up a fish to a yoke? Is he going to have a dolphin plow his field? 2 out of the 3 categories of animals that Genesis tells human beings to subdue and rule generally only make sense if humanity's killing them for their own purposes. So it's not as if Genesis 1 tells mankind that they may eat vegetables while remaining silent about consumption of meat. The passage heavily implies that they are to eat meat, especially birds and fish, then proceeds to mention God's provision of vegetables in addition. If the animals were considered armed enough to present a combat struggle with man as the dominion mandate assumes, then surely their hostility expressed itself against other animals in the natural world as well. Our second stop's Genesis 9, 1-5. It reads, And God blessed Noah and his sons, and said to them, Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, and your fear and your dread will be upon all animals of the earth, upon all birds of the sky, and all that creeps on the earth, and in all the fish of the sea. In your hand they are given. All moving which lives will be to you for food. Like a green plant, I give to you everything. Only meat of which the blood is in it you may not eat. Some young earthers argue that this passage is the first time in history that mankind was permitted by God to eat meat.
In fact, after the event of Noah's flood, God told Noah that now humans could eat meat, could eat animal flesh, but before that time, they're instructed only to be vegetarian.
Right out the gate, this interpretation is unlikely for several reasons. First, God himself had already made Adam and Eve leather clothing after they had sinned. If it was okay for the man and woman to exploit the skins of dead creatures, why not also their flesh? Also, before the flood, we read in Genesis 4:4 that Abel was favored by God over his brother because he brought God the fat of his livestock. What, did Abel cut away the tallow then leave the meat out to rot in a field? Considering evidence we see that meat was previously being consumed at God's pleasure, why does Genesis 9:1-5 even go out of the way to declare man's right to eat meat after the flood? Isn't it strange for God to declare humanity's right to do what everyone was already permitted to do? In short, without getting into the syntax, Van E found that Genesis 9 does this because it's following a classic Hebraic formula for introducing prohibitive legislation, in which, quote, an entire class of animals is designated as proper for food or as improper, with the following restrictive clause providing the exceptions. Other specimens of this same Hebraic structure can also be observed in places like Deuteronomy 14:6-7, 14:9-10, and 14:11-12, with a good handful of parallels in Leviticus 11. Each of the Deuteronomy passages here are specifically examples of other dietary law passages that likewise start by giving a broad scope of things already permitted for consumption, then follows by specifying a prohibition concerning them. Simply put, Genesis 9:3's affirmation of man's right to eat meat is part of a formal introduction setting up the immediately following prohibitions regarding consumption of blood and violence in the next verse. Likely because this sort of disrespect for blood life is what motivated God to flood the earth in the first place. There is therefore no implication that eating meat was previously prohibited. To the contrary, the Hebraic prohibitive formula used in this passage assumes that eating meat was previously permitted. Moving on to Isaiah 11. Isaiah projects what things will be like when the Messiah comes and God creates the new heavens and new earth. And a shoot will come from the stump of Jesse, and the wolf will sojourn with the lamb, and the leopard and the young goat will lie down, and the calf and young lion and the fatted calf will be together, and the little child shall lead them, and the cow and the bear will graze together, and their young ones will lie down, and the lion will eat straw like an ox, and the suckling child will play on the den of the asp, and an infant will put his hand on the adder's den. None will hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain. Young earthers claim that Isaiah is drawing this imagery here from an original creation which had no animal hostility and death, and that he's projecting that original perfect state forward into what the new creation will look like.
What sense does it make to point to the kingdom and the consummation as when the lamb and the lion shall be together and lay together, if indeed there was predation before the fall?
But is it really the case that Isaiah is drawing this image from the original creation, especially given the fact that the fall narrative of Genesis never connects animal death with the fall, and the strong evidence we've seen that the original creation mandate assumes animal death? Inspect the passage more closely. Notice which creatures it says will be free from harm of predators. The lamb, young goat, calf, fatted calf, little child, cow, ox, suckling child, and infant. What do these 9 things have in common? They're all members of the human domain. You will notice that this passage doesn't say that the deer will be safe from the wolf, or the hare from the eagle, or the gazelle from the lion. Trinity College archaeologist John J. Bimson, whose research career has specialized in biblical ecotheology, writes, "The prophet is not concerned with predation with animals as such, but with the danger certain animals pose to human welfare. This is clear from the fact that the animals that enjoy safety from former predators are the lamb, the goat, the calf, and the cow, domesticated animals that were vital to the ancient Israelite economy." Van E agrees that these, quote, are usual members of the flock or herd, so the image is not taken from nature in general, but from a specifically human context. If it is true, as these scholars suspect, that Isaiah isn't speaking of a state of animal peace in the animal kingdom at large, where is Isaiah taking this imagery from if not Eden? The answer? Divine blessing curse texts from the Torah and the prophets. Throughout the Bible, animal harm upon the human domain is frequently associated with divine cursing. When the children of Israel complained in the desert, God cursed them with venomous serpents. Among the blessings and curses God sets before the Israelites in Leviticus 26, he tells them in verse 22 that if they don't obey him, he will, quote, send among you the beasts of the field, and they will bereave you of your children, and destroy your livestock, and make you few, and your roads will become desolate. Van E also points us to passages like Deuteronomy 32:24. The teeth of the beasts I will send among them, among the venomous crawlers in the dust. Tellingly, Jeremiah also lists some of the same animals described by Isaiah in the context of divine curses. In 5:6 we read, quote, "A lion of the forest shall slay them. A wolf of the desert plains will destroy them. A leopard lies watching upon their cities. All that go out from them will be torn in pieces, because their transgressions are many." Later, Jeremiah has God sending venomous snakes in retribution. But of course, biblical divine curses usually come with their opposites attached in the form of a blessing, provided Israel was obedient. If we go back to examine Leviticus 26 again, we will find in verse 6 that God says he will reward obedience to his laws by, quote, "ridding evil beasts from out of the land." In Psalm 91:13, we read that the one who follows Yahweh's commands will, quote, "trample the lion and the adder." In Job 5:23, Eliphaz speaks of how the righteous will be at peace with the beasts of the field. Vanny also draws our attention to Hosea 2:18, quote, "I will cut a covenant for them on that day with the beasts of the field." So Isaiah isn't retrojecting an original universal state of animal peace into the eschaton in this passage. He is applying a prophetic blessing about a covenant God will make with the human domain and its livestock. The distinguished historian of theology Gisbert van den Brink at the Universities of Amsterdam and Leiden agrees, quote, "In the eschatological passages like Isaiah 11:6-9 and 65:25, there is no indication that suffering, death, and extinction of animals in the present dispensation is seen as a result of human sin. When we apply such texts to the animal world as well, it seems that we are extending their meaning beyond what they intend to say within their original context." So you're probably wondering, how literal is Isaiah intending when he says that lions will dine on straw like oxen? Does he really mean to say that people will one day lead out wolves and leopards and bears to pasture with their goats and sheep? These types of oracles of eschatological blessings frequently employ intense hyperbole as a standard Hebraic device. For example, Vanny points us to Hosea's language of how in the new creation, sweet wine will drip down from mountains and flood the hills. It's not necessarily obvious that Isaiah's point is literally that God's people will one day keep and farm bears and lions for agriculture. To conclude, if your theological conscience requires you to believe that the earth is 6,000 years old, which is where I was at for years, it may help you to at least know that you aren't required by Genesis to also swallow the doctrine that Tyrannosaurus originally used his 9-inch long, literally serrated teeth set in a jaw capable of exerting some 8,000 pounds of force to hunt melons. I'm sure many will find these conclusions theologically upsetting, but Northwest Semitic literary analysis doesn't really care what we moderns find upsetting. Subscribe and stick around. More content's on the way.